And I think he does know who's boss, and the boss is Netanyahu, at least insofar as the events in the Middle East are concerned. President Trump is not in control. Mr. Netanyahu is in control. And I don't see any evidence that that's going to change in the short run. And that, of course, opens Pandora's box for all sorts of other things to come out.
Douglas Macgregor just revealed Benjamin Netanyahu's control over Trump and U.S. foreign policy. And in this clip, he gets into how Trump tries to hide that fact sometimes, unsuccessfully so in my mind, and the prospects of Israel dragging the U.S. back into war with Iran. So let's get right into it. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
Do you think that Benjamin Netanyahu has any intention whatsoever of removing IDF troops from Gaza?
Frankly, no. Whatever he does, it will be at best a gesture. And that's why I sent you something that Chris Hedges read on his program, which was a leaflet from the IDF. And it made it very clear that the people in Gaza and eventually, I think, on the West Bank have a choice. They can either flee or be killed. This is the campaign of mass murder and expulsion. That's not going to change. And in fact, we've seen strikes go into Lebanon and other places since Mr. Netanyahu spoke with President Trump on the phone. I don't think President Trump has any real influence over Mr. Netanyahu. So the short answer is I don't expect anything of real substance or value to come out of these talks.
Well, why should Hamas even negotiate with the Israelis? This is the very same negotiating team the Israelis tried to murder in Doha.
I think the view in Hamas and probably in much of the Middle East is whether you like it or not, you have to give it a shot. You've got to try. You've got to talk and see if anything good can come of it. And I think their expectations are very low. And I'm sure they're all watching the skies overhead and they're very concerned about their own lives. But if they refuse to talk, they refuse to meet with the Israelis, then they will be accused of wanting this war to continue into perpetuity. So I think that's what it boils down to. You know, right now, there are lots of people who want desperately to end this. I mean, the Egyptians are a good example. They're talking about bringing additional U.S. forces into the Sinai. They're hoping that we'll get between the Israelis and them. They're worried about what's happening not only in Gaza, but in Lebanon, in Syria. This whole thing is explosive. It's a giant tinderbox.
Yeah, it sure is. And the prospect of this creeping into a greater Middle Eastern war is not something that I want to endure as a U.S. taxpayer looking at foreign policy going down the drain for regular Americans at the same time where people are having a hard time making ends meet. But yeah, I'm generally with Macgregor here. They have to try for a peace process if they are trying. In many ways, this seems to be a deal that's been altered to Israel's liking after Arab leaders had inputs, and that's akin to in The Empire Strikes Back when Darth Vader says, "We've altered the deal, pray that we don't alter it farther," or something to that effect. But man, this deal is of the kind that it seems to empower the Israelis above anyone else, doesn't talk about the possibility of a Palestinian state, speaks in point 20 about some abstract time horizon that isn't clarified or quantified in any manner, dictating the processing of peace in the future, seems to focus more on entrepreneurial colonialism with Jared Kushner and Tony Blair coming in to redevelop Gaza and create the Gaza Riviera than it does to actually solve this peace. But I will say, when Hamas, I think, brilliantly responded to this and said, hey, we'll release all the hostages, they kind of called the Israeli bluff because Israel had said, as part of its propaganda the whole time, that's our biggest prerogative, even though I think that's a lie. Benjamin Netanyahu likes the fact that they have, 48 Israeli hostages, such that he can use that as the pretext for his ethnic cleansing campaign. But they made that the priority of their return, but said, hey, some of these other things we have problems with. So we'll see what happens. I just have the mentality and the intuition to believe at this point that Israel's going to take anything Hamas says or does as an excuse to say, hey, we tried to give them a deal and they rejected it again, just like they did in 2000, loading the Camp David Accords with poison pills.
No one knows what will actually bring it off. And then we have Iran looming on the horizon as the next major target for Mr. Netanyahu.
Before I ask you about U.S. military preparation for a war in Iran and maybe a war in Venezuela, I want to ask you about President Trump. You mentioned earlier that he says things differently in public than he says in private. Well, we all know that. He has publicly told Prime Minister Netanyahu, I'm not going to let you annex the West Bank, even though they have de facto annexed it already. And he has publicly said, now that we have an agreement in principle, stop the bombing. But Netanyahu has thumbed his nose at both of those public statements. Is it likely he has contradicted himself in private to Netanyahu, or is it likely Netanyahu knows who's the boss between the two of them?
We have to consider the possibility that what he says in private is different, unfortunately. And I think he does know who's boss, and the boss is Netanyahu. At least insofar as the events in the Middle East are concerned, President Trump is not in control. Mr. Netanyahu is in control. And I don't see any evidence that that's going to change in the short run. So I think that privately, it's eminently possible he says, look, I've got a lot of people who are extremely upset about what's going on and our support for what you're doing. I have to make these statements in public. He may well have said that. And Netanyahu may have nodded. We understand completely, and he's going to continue doing what he's doing regardless. That's a possibility. But right now, Mr. Netanyahu is in charge. Let's face it, those are the facts.
Yeah, I think he's exactly right here. I couldn't agree with this more. And it is, a perverted aspect of this U.S.-Israeli relationship where it seems like the benefactor of all the billions of dollars in U.S. aid, it's been something like $32 billion since October 7th. You have that dynamic. And then the dynamic is that Israel seems to have more of a stranglehold over our government than vice versa, dragging us into its wars. Having the U.S. president look the other way at the genocide. Back this Netanyahu-led peace effort, which might be a smokescreen anyways. And Napolitano's exactly right about Israel essentially de facto annexing the West Bank anyways, if it's not, de jure or in accordance with law, because that's what the policy is right now. Israel controls something like 66%, about 2/3 of the West Bank settlements right now, and are in the process of carving out more in Syria and Lebanon. That's why they want the Iranian regime to go down too, just like the Syrian regime went down. So it's destabilized, and there's, the campaign for a greater Israel to expand Israel's borders into those territories. It's not really a mystery. Netanyahu has spoken about this and pointed to, new borders potentially for Israel on these, hypothetical maps that he's held up from time to time. So Israel occupies Area C of the West Bank. It's divided into 3 areas, A, B, and C, and they're trying to expand it. So this is all correct. It does seem like Netanyahu's in the driver's seat in that relationship, I hate to say.
Colonel, what military preparations is the United States making of which you are aware for an invasion or to support the Israeli invasion? I'm sure there's a difference, and you can tell us, of Iran.
Well, I don't think the Israelis are planning on invading Iran. That's very unlikely. Now, will they pre-position what we would call special operators and intelligence agents in Iran? I'm sure they already have, although it's probably more difficult now than it was before. But it's still, unfortunately, surprisingly easy to buy people. And even though you execute them as traitors later on, that still is appealing to too many people. And I think that's happened in Iran and other countries in the Muslim world. Now, having said that, we are moving ammunition. We are moving weapon systems into the region, into the Eastern Mediterranean, into the Red Sea, and probably, I don't know much about the Indian Ocean. I can't comment on that, but we know those things have happened. We know that we have at least 2 batteries of theater high altitude air defense missiles on the ground. We know that inventory of missiles has been built up since the last round for 12 days. So I think there's a lot of evidence, yes, that in terms of people, forces, and ammunition, we're getting ready to do something in support of Israel. I don't think we're prepared to directly strike immediately, but we have to accept the high probability that if things don't go well for Israel, that we will participate. And that, of course, opens Pandora's box for all sorts of other things to come out, including the Russians, the Chinese, the Pakistanis, and so forth.
Yeah, totally agree. And I always said on this channel when covering this 12-day war back in, what was it, June or July? I think June, right? Or July, I can't remember. It was one of the two. But in either way, I kept saying it was only a matter of time. This ceasefire isn't going to last. It's only a matter of time before the propaganda drums start being beat again by either Netanyahu or Trump, talking about, hey, how close Iran is to a nuclear weapon. They're already fanning the flames for this thing again, trying to drag the U.S. into it. I'm with Macgregor when it comes to, I don't think that Israel's going to send ground troops there. That's what they want to use the U.S. for. They want to use the U.S. for the regime change aspect, which isn't possible just through military strikes. It's only possible through a ground invasion. That's what the lessons of history say. I haven't heard of any actual regime change effort that came from an external party that didn't involve boots on the ground. And you can see Netanyahu making the media rounds to this effect right now, saying Iran's developing a nuclear missile to hit the U.S., right? This absurdity is back again. We're not falling for it, Zionists. We're not falling for it, Likudniks. We're not falling it for the prospects of Greater Israel. And look who's interviewing him right here. The top neocon in the country is interviewing him, completely interested in this story, of course, above all other stories, and why we need to send U.S. resources to have a regime change in Iran, siding, of course, with Israel first in every single situation. That's what Ben Shapiro specializes in. And you can see the absurdity here with Netanyahu saying, Iran can blackmail any American city. People don't believe it. Iran is developing intercontinental missiles with a range of 8,000 kilometers. Iran poses no threat to the United States. They prove that with the retaliation strike in the 12-day war, by the way, being able to touch as many U.S. troops as they wanted, essentially, in that region, in Qatar and, the Arabian Peninsula in general, where there are many U.S. bases, but they didn't because they don't want that fight. This is silly neocon propaganda that unfortunately is going to be spread again, and it has no bearing in truth. Do not trust these vile neocons that have flushed our foreign policy down the drain and increased debt and created inflation in the process.
If this is another war like the 12-day one in June, which is aimed at decapitation and destruction of nuclear weaponry, that will be the stated purpose. As a practical matter, we all know that Prime Minister Netanyahu knows that the Iranians don't have deliverable nuclear weapons, and his goal is to turn Iran into another Syria. Okay, my question is a little too long. What can the Israelis defeat Iran missiles? Stated differently, can Iran neutralize Israeli defenses?
I think we have to assume, based on what we saw the last time, that the Iranians can employ their entire arsenal, which they did not do in the past. That arsenal is quite capable of penetrating Israel's air and missile defenses. And I think it can also defeat much of what we have. Not completely, but substantial penetration, which means $50 billion of damage the last time, perhaps $80 to $100 billion worth of damage or more this time. What the real question is, if we're right about that, and we think that the Iranian integrated air defenses are now much better than they were the last time. They may not be 100% of what the Iranians would like, but they're probably 60 to 70% of what the Iranians would like. You add that to this enormous strike arsenal. How long before the Israelis finally conclude that they cannot achieve what you just outlined? I think they're still dedicated and devoted, frankly, to this notion that they can decapitate the Iranian regime. The Iranians have already said, fine, do your worst, because we have redundancy. In other words, we have people lined up to take over in the event that some of our leaders or many of our leaders are killed.
And that's what they tried to do. They tried to blackmail, which Israel specializes in blackmail. That's why it's particularly hypocritical and ironic for Netanyahu to say Iran is blackmailing the United States. But that's what Israel tried to do. They tried to talk these high-ranking generals and officials in the Iranian government to giving up their arms, surrendering now, or we're going to kill your family. We know where your family is. They struck at regime targets. They want the U.S. to bail them out, and they're pretty much counting on it. Can't say that they're wrong at that. The U.S. just sits by their side no matter what kind of bloodshed or backward policy they launch into, whatever military strike they want. The U.S. and the AIPAC lobby support that at all costs, and that is heeded by U.S. representatives and the president, I hate to say, who's captured by the Israel lobby. The talons of Miriam Adelson are sunk deeply into his orange flesh. So this is exactly right. That's what they want. They're going to keep trying to get this. This is the only country in the list of 7 as part of the clean break memo that Wesley Clark saw at the Pentagon, detailing all the regime change that the U.S. in collaboration with Israel wanted. And every one of those has happened. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Somalia, Sudan. I'm forgetting the other, and then it's Iran. That's the final one. And yeah, that's what we're dealing with now.
What then do you do as an Israeli when you realize everything you've tried has failed? Do you turn to the use of a nuclear weapon? That's always been my greatest concern with the Israelis, because they can deliver those. They can deliver them from the sea, from their Dolphin-class submarines that were built for them by the Germans. And they don't have to necessarily fly it in. They also have missiles, but they'd have to move those much closer, obviously, to deliver them. Bottom line is, we don't know. And thus far, we've seen a lot of evidence that Mr. Netanyahu is going to do whatever the hell Mr. Netanyahu wants to do, Judge.
Well, yeah, that is the truth. Isn't that the truth, right? And that's the hardship we're feeling in terms of U.S. foreign policy, if you can even call it that. It's just a default to side with Israel no matter what. What kind of policy is that? That no matter what your greatest ally in the Middle East does, you're just going to default to that. That's not really a foreign policy. That's a perversion. That's an abandonment of U.S. sovereignty is what that is. And look, I think there's no doubting Netanyahu's control over Trump in so many ways, and a lot of the naysayers of this idea point to, oh, no, Trump was mad at Netanyahu. He said, he condemned and denounced Netanyahu for firing missiles at Iran after the ceasefire was announced, and, he had that video on the tarmac of him so mad at both sides, but that never manifests into actual policy. That never manifests into using U.S. leverage over Israel, and there's plenty of freaking leverage over Israel. If it actually wanted to be, theoretically, you could just withdraw aid, threaten to withdraw aid. That never happens. Under no imaginable circumstance would that happen with AIPAC in such control of our government right now. And in the same case, Trump recently came out and said, hey, we do not accept you annexing the West Bank. You don't have our endorsement to do that. Again, this could be the case where he's saying that, but if Netanyahu literally annexed the West Bank, or by the way, Netanyahu doesn't agree to the terms of this Gaza deal and, unleashes one of the biggest airstrikes against Gaza that's happened since the beginning of this war, which is really a genocide, that support would still remain. It's unconditional. That's the toxic nature of the U.S.-Israeli alliance, and frankly, the toxic nature of the Israel First mentality, the same mentality our ruling class abides by to a T in every single circumstance. I'm not just trying to blackpill you here, I'm just trying to spit out the truth. As to whether this Gaza plan works or not, I don't know. I'm not very optimistic about that, but at the same time, it surprised me a bit when Trump announced, hey, Hamas is ready for peace. But I don't think Trump really thinks that. I think he wants to get out of this thing because it's clearly causing a rift and a big schism in his support base, where you have very ardent Zionists and also non-interventionists that don't want to side with Israel on everything. Or there's shades in between, but you can see how this is ripping up his movement right now. It's not just this, it's the Epstein files and some other things, but those things are interrelated to some extent too. But I do want to hear from you. Let me know down below. Am I right? Will this peace deal work? Will Iran drag the U.S. into a war? Or will Israel drag the U.S. into a war with Iran again? And does Netanyahu have more control over Trump than vice versa? Let me know in the comments down below. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, also subscribe to Judge Napolitano. Awesome interview here. If you like my commentary and you like this video, please click the join button below and consider becoming a member. If you become a member, you'll help support the channel, and I'd really appreciate that. That'd mean the world to me, actually. And in return for that, I'll give you the gift of having access to all my videos before they go live to the general public on YouTube. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.